The latest port of a Capcom coin-op is easily the most impressive thus far. Strider was a hit in arcades upon its release in 1989, where it really stood out thanks to its fantastic presentation. And the only place to get a surprisingly faithful port of the coin-op was on the Mega Drive. Once again, Sega truly brought the arcade home on their 16-bit console. The game follows the exploits of Hiryu, the youngest member of the elite Strider assassin organization, on his quest to bring down Grandmaster Mayo. The globe-hopping adventure puts Hiryu in a lot of different locations, from a future Soviet Kazakhstan to deep in the Amazon jungle to a massive airship high above the Earth's surface. Gameplay in Strider is very straightforward. In the vein of classics like Shinobi, Ghouls and Ghosts, and Rastan Saga, Hiryu mostly runs to the right and slashes away at anything in front of him using his lightning-fast plasma sword. Control is tight and responsive, making Hiryu's acrobatic moves feel like second nature. Plus, his ability to cling to walls gives the game a lot of verticality as well. Those of you old enough to remember Strider's release on the Genesis will probably remember the ads as well, which touted the fact that the Strider cartridge was the largest in history at the time, weighing in at a whopping 8 megabits. Today that's a bit laughable, but Sega successfully marketed the cartridge size as a difference maker back then. To put that into perspective, 8 megabits equals 1 megabyte. A single-layer Blu-ray disc holds 25,000 megabytes. There was, of course, a version of Strider released for the NES as well. But like many arcade ports on the system, it was wildly different than its source material. The Nintendo game is much more story-driven, really only sharing the opening level theme and main character with the arcade game. It's debatable whether this is better or worse. But it's hard to argue that Sega scored quite the win here. Not only was the Genesis game gorgeous, but it was almost a carbon copy of the very popular arcade game. Except the real reason behind the two different versions of the game is a bit more complicated than that. Strider was originally conceived as a 3-part product partnership between Capcom and an artist circle called Moto Kikaku. The plan was to collaborate and produce manga and 2 video games, one for the Famicom and 1 arcade game based on the Strider Hiryu character. After agreeing on a general setting and basic character story elements, the 3 men in charge of the various projects, Tatsumi Wada on the manga, Kouchi Yotsui on the arcade game, and Masahiko Kurokawa on the Famicom title, were left to their own devices to create their various media. The manga series was the first to hit, being released in 6 parts starting in May 1988. It chronicles the story of Hiryu following his retirement from the Strider group, his subsequent blackmail, and his quest to end the corruption of the group and the mastermind behind it all. Kurokawa ended up collaborating with Wada quite closely, and so the Famicom cartridge is an adventure game with a very similar story to the manga. Oddly enough, the game was never released in Japan, despite being announced and advertised. It was, however, released in the US for some reason, even though the manga never made it to these shores. Rather than collaborating further with his counterparts, Kouchi Yotsui viewed the project as a contest to see who could come up with the better experience, and so the arcade game shares only the most basic link to the other versions of Strider. Yotsui wanted to take the Ghouls and Ghosts formula further, and didn't want to try telling an elaborate story in an arcade game. So really, the NES game is not a watered-down port of the arcade version, but a completely different game with a different timeline set in the same universe. But man, is the Genesis version fantastic.